It was the perfect cover. The courtroom was tense as the foster mother tried to maintain her composure. She exchanged a quick glance with her husband, whispering, "It's almost over." The judges' praise for their parenting skills had bolstered their confidence. Victory seemed certain. They believed the boy would remain in their care for good. But the proceedings took an unexpected turn when the child spoke up. His voice cracked the silence of that courtroom, and everything the foster parents had planned for began to unravel. The mother hadn't prepared for the presence of two women near the back of the courtroom, neighbors who had spent 2 years quietly building a case against her. It was the perfect cover. To Sarah and Steve Rauch, these women were an intrusion into a private family matter. To Elsie and Denise, they were the only thing standing between a 13-year-old and a life with people he could no longer trust. Sarah and Stephen Rauch were, by every outward measure, an affluent and successful couple who had chosen to channel their good fortune into foster care. Beneath the surface, that choice had grown out of a private grief. Years earlier, a fertility specialist had told them Stephen couldn't father children, and Sarah's body couldn't safely carry a pregnancy. A visit to a Jacksonville foster home changed their direction, and they decided to foster instead of pursuing adoption. For years, their neighbors saw only a parade of seemingly happy kids coming and going. No one thought to look closer until Elsie and her wife Denise moved in next door. Working from home gave Elsie a front row seat to sounds most neighbors would never catch: raised voices, a door slamming harder than it should. At first, she and Denise tried addressing it directly with Sarah. Their son Kevin's friendship with one of the Rauch children gave them a closer window into the household. And it was Kevin who first mentioned the Rauch's plan to formally adopt Desan, the 13-year-old boy he'd grown close to. For Elsie, that changed everything. If Desan stayed a foster child, the state could still intervene. If he was adopted, that safety net disappeared for good. Feeling a moral obligation she couldn't shake, Elsie decided she had to act. Desan had endeared himself to Elsie and Denise over their 2 years next door, polite in a way that felt almost rehearsed. His steadying influence on Kevin left Elsie wondering what kind of upbringing produced a boy who tried so hard to take up so little space. Sarah had charmed the couple with her wit, Steve with stories from his military service, and together they presented the picture of an ideal family. It would take nearly 2 years for Elsie and Denise to see the cracks beneath that image. Now the two couples sat on opposite sides of a courtroom as Desan's adoption hearing reached its final stage. For 2 months, Elsie and Denise had formally opposed it, driven by everything they'd seen from next door. But opposition alone wasn't proof, and both women understood the uncomfortable truth. Knowing something in your gut and proving it to a judge were two very different things. Elsie regretted not documenting things sooner: a date, a time, a photograph, anything concrete. When she was called to the stand, she caught Desan's eye across the room, sitting quietly beside the two people who were, on paper, about to become his permanent parents. Perhaps they began fostering with good intentions, she said, her voice starting to waver. But something changed along the way. She admitted she couldn't fully explain what had shifted in that house, only that her instincts as a parent wouldn't let her stay silent. As she spoke, Sarah and Steve exchanged a look of practiced calm. It rattled her enough that, with the judge's permission, Denise walked her back to her seat. It seemed painfully unlikely they would win. Denise had been more cautious than Elsie at first, wanting to be sure before accusing two respected neighbors of something so serious. That caution disappeared on a Friday evening months earlier, when she glanced out from their upstairs window at the exact moment raised voices turned into something else. Steve's hand closing too hard around Desan's arm, the boy going rigid and silent in a way that told her this wasn't the first time. She never described exactly what she saw to anyone but Elsie. It was enough to end any doubt she had left. Back in the courtroom, Desan carried the weight of everything he'd endured and was still too afraid to say. Sarah and Steve had spent weeks coaching him before every hearing, reminding him softly of what would happen if he said the wrong thing. Then, as the judge began reading toward a final decision, something in Desan shifted. He thought about years of flinching at raised voices, of the bruise on his arm from 3 weeks earlier that he'd told his teacher came from falling off his bike. He thought about spending the rest of his childhood pretending none of it had happened. For the first time, the fear of speaking felt smaller than the fear of staying silent. As the judge began delivering his decision, praising Sarah and Steve's original intentions, Desan felt his heart pounding. Just before the adoption could be finalized, he stood up. "Your Honor, I need to tell you something," he said, his voice trembling but clear. The courtroom went silent. Every eye turned to the boy, now standing, visibly shaking. He glanced toward Elsie and Denise, tears already in their eyes. "Sarah and Steve aren't who they seem," Desan said, struggling to find words he'd swallowed for so long. "They've hurt me, not just yelling, hurting me. They told me if I said anything, no one would believe me, and I'd end up somewhere worse. But I can't do this anymore." The judge's expression shifted from routine certainty to something far more serious. "Can you tell us more about what's been happening?" Through tears, Desan described the pattern he'd lived inside for 2 years. The sudden bursts of anger, the bruises explained away to teachers, the threats that kept him quiet every time he almost told someone. Sarah's composed expression finally cracked. Steve stared at the floor. Elsie and Denise sat frozen, heartbroken and relieved in the same breath, knowing they had been right to speak up. Moved by what he'd heard, the judge halted the adoption and ordered a full investigation, placing Desan into emergency protective care that same day. In the weeks that followed, caseworkers uncovered a pattern that extended beyond Desan, other children who had passed through the Rausch home, each with a story that had gone unheard. Sarah and Steve were arrested and charged, and the image they'd spent years building collapsed overnight. Elsie and Denise felt no satisfaction watching their neighbors face consequences, only a quiet, exhausted relief that they'd gotten Desan out in time. The trial ended with Sarah and Steve convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to substantial time in prison. Desan was placed with a family that gave him what he'd been missing for years: stability, patience, and the freedom of not having to watch his own words. Their case also prompted local officials to revisit how foster placements were vetted, closing gaps that had let a family like the Rausches go unquestioned. In his new home, Desan slowly let his guard down, making friends without calculating what might happen if he said the wrong thing. He started to believe in small pieces that the safety he'd only pretended to have with the Rausches might be real this time. His story is a reminder that the adults paying attention from just outside a family's front door sometimes see what the system misses, and that speaking up even without proof can be the only thing, standing between a child and a life no one should have to survive. This story is a dramatization inspired by real patterns seen in foster care cases, with names and identifying details changed. If something in this story felt familiar, we'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you've ever spoken up when it would have been easier to stay quiet, we want to hear that too. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.